In the vast, blood-soaked expanse of the 41st millennium, where there is only war and the cruel laughter of thirsting gods, few scenarios better illustrate the fundamental nature of the galaxy's warring factions than the hypothetical capture of a space marine dreadnought by Orks. Picture, if you will, a towering war machine, tens of thousands of pounds of ceramite and adamantium lying broken on a battlefield, still smoking from orbital bombardment. The landscape around it is a charnel house, strewn with the bodies of both Orks and Imperial defenders. Craters pock the scorched earth where artillery shells fell like rain. The air itself tastes of promethium and burned flesh, thick enough to choke a baseline human. Inside its armored sarcophagus, suspended in amniotic fluid, a warrior who has served the Emperor for centuries continues to live, or rather, continues to endure. This is not a fresh recruit who has just been interred, their memories of flesh and blood existence still vivid. No, this is an ancient, a being who has walked the battlefields of 100 worlds, who has witnessed the rise and fall of imperial governors, who has seen tactical doctrines evolve and change while they remained unchanged, eternal in their service. Their designation might be Brother Ancient Cassius, or Venerable Thaddeus, or any of 1,000 names carved into honor rolls throughout the Imperium. But to the Orks now surrounding the fallen war machine, they are simply prey, a prize to be claimed and exploited. The Orks, those brutal, fungal xenos who live only for the joy of battle, have claimed this prize after hours of savage fighting. Perhaps the Dreadnought fell defending a choke point, buying time for evacuating civilians or retreating guard regiments. Perhaps it was overwhelmed by sheer numbers, firing its assault cannon until the barrels glowed white-hot and ammunition hoppers ran dry. Perhaps a lucky Ork tankbuster's rockets found the weak points in its armor, crippling the motive systems and leaving the ancient warrior immobilized and vulnerable. The specific circumstances matter less than the outcome. The walking tomb now belongs to the Greenskins. They have dragged it back to their ramshackle fortress, a sprawling collection of scrap metal structures and crude fortifications that defies every principle of proper military engineering. Chains as thick as a man's torso bind the Dreadnought, looped around its limbs and torso. Dozens of Orks haul on these chains, bellowing with effort and excitement. Others beat drums made from fuel barrels, the rhythm driving the procession forward. Still more fire their weapons into the air in celebration, because Orks celebrate everything with gunfire if they can manage it. They are eager to pry open this walking tomb and make its occupant reveal the secrets of the hated Space Marines. In their crude understanding, this prize represents access to enemy intelligence, to technological secrets, perhaps even to some understanding of what makes their most dangerous opponents so formidable. Mechboys dream of reverse engineering the Dreadnought's weapons systems. Painboys salivate at the prospect of vivisecting a Space Marine's enhanced biology. The warboss who claimed the prize imagines the glory of breaking an enemy that even other Orks respect as proper ard. But here's the thing that makes this scenario so darkly fascinating, so quintessentially Warhammer 40,000. It doesn't matter what the Orks do. They could subject the entombed Space Marine to every torture in their limited repertoire. They could have their painboys conduct their most horrific experiments. They could threaten, cajole, bribe, or attempt to bargain. The Dreadnought will never talk about the Emperor, not in the way the Orks might want, not in a way that betrays or diminishes or questions. The ancient warrior might speak of the master of mankind, certainly. He might proclaim the Emperor's glory even as crude Ork tools tear at his life support systems. He might preach the Imperial truth or the Imperial creed as painboys vivisect what remains of his mortal form, but renounce his faith, question his devotion, provide useful intelligence born of fear or pain. Never, not in 1,000 years of Ork interrogation. This isn't merely about superhuman endurance, though Space Marines possess that in abundance. It's not simply a matter of enhanced physiology, despite the fact that Astartes are built to withstand torments that would shatter lesser beings. The reason a captured dreadnought cannot be made to betray the Emperor through Ork methods goes far deeper, touching on the very nature of what it means to be a space marine, what it means to be an Ork, and the fundamental incompatibilities between these two species. It's a collision between faith so absolute it transcends reason and violence so pure it knows no subtlety. It's the unstoppable force meeting the truly immovable object, played out in the most brutal theatre imaginable. To understand why this scenario is doomed to failure from the Ork perspective, we must first understand what a dreadnought actually is. Not the towering war engine that strides across battlefields, raining death upon the Emperor's enemies, but the broken, barely living thing contained within its armored shell. We must comprehend the depths of faith that sustain a space marine, the layers of mental conditioning that armor their psyche more effectively than ceramite plates armor their bodies. And we must recognize the fundamental limitations of Ork psychology, the ways in which their brutal, direct nature makes them perhaps the least equipped of all the galaxy's horrors to break a mind that has already been rebuilt in the Emperor's image. The nature of the dreadnought, a walking tomb. Before we can understand why Orks cannot break a dreadnought's faith, we must first grasp the terrible truth of what a dreadnought actually is. The towering war machines that stride across battlefields are not merely vehicles piloted by space marines. They are not suits of especially large armor. They are walking sarcophagi, cybernetic tombs that contain the broken remnants of warriors too valuable to let die, but too damaged to ever truly live again. The process of becoming a dreadnought begins with catastrophic injury. Not just severe wounds, mind you, but trauma so extensive that even the legendary apothecaries of the Adeptus Astartes cannot repair it. We're talking about space marines whose spines have been shattered beyond the capacity of their modified biology to heal. Warriors whose bodies have been crushed, burned, or mutilated to the point where flesh and bone simply cannot be restored. These are injuries that would mean instant death for any normal human, and which even the superhuman physiology of an Astartes cannot overcome. When such a catastrophic injury befalls a space marine of sufficient renown, of proven valor and tactical acumen, a terrible choice is made. Rather than grant them the Emperor's peace, the honorable death that would allow their gene seed to be harvested for the next generation of warriors, the chapter's tech marines and apothecaries conspire to preserve what little remains. The broken body is encased in a cybernetic sarcophagus, a life support system of staggering complexity. What's left of the marine, often little more than a torso, head, and a few vital organs, is suspended in amniotic fluid. This thick, cold liquid fills what remains of their lungs, sustaining them in a state that exists somewhere between life and death. The process of integration is excruciating beyond description. Neural connection ports must be driven directly into the brain and spinal cord, creating an interface between dying flesh and immortal machine. The pain of this procedure is so intense that it can kill even a space marine through shock alone, despite all their genetic modifications, despite all their mental conditioning. Those who survive the initial integration emerge changed, diminished in some fundamental way. They have traded their humanity, already drastically reduced by becoming an Astartes, for the cold certainty of service without end. Life inside a dreadnought sarcophagus is not life as most beings would understand it. The entombed warrior has no physical sensation in any normal sense. They cannot feel the ground beneath their feet because they have no feet. They cannot clench their fists in rage or determination because their hands have long since withered to useless appendages, if they remain at all. Every sensation comes filtered through mechanical sensors, translated into nerve impulses that a human brain was never meant to process. They see through optical arrays that process light in wavelengths beyond human perception. They hear through audio pickups that can detect frequencies no organic ear could register. Touch, that most fundamental of human senses, is replaced by pressure sensors and structural integrity monitors. But perhaps the worst aspect of dreadnought existence is the sleep. Between battles, when a dreadnought is not needed, they are placed into stasis. The chapter's tech marines seal them in vaults deep within the fortress monastery, and the ancient warriors are allowed, or perhaps forced, to slumber. This is not the sleep of normal men, filled with dreams and the processing of memories. It is a void, a darkness so complete that when consciousness returns, many dreadnoughts struggle to remember if they had ever existed at all. Time loses all meaning in this state. Decades can pass in what feels like an instant, or a single night of stasis can stretch into what feels like centuries of empty oblivion. The psychological toll of this existence cannot be overstated. Dreadnoughts are described in the lore as suffering from severe mental stress, including lethargy, confusion, dyschronometria, the loss of time perception, and even senility. Some go mad from the isolation, screaming into the void of their sarcophagi between battles. Others become so detached from their former humanity that they function more like advanced artificial intelligences than living beings, responding to situations with cold, tactical precision, devoid of any emotional context. Many dreadnoughts describe their existence as torture, and they are not being hyperbolic. Malcarion, a dreadnought of the Night Lords, famously characterized his centuries of service as an endless torment, waking only for battle and then returning to cold, dreamless sleep with no sense of triumph or accomplishment. The novel, The Glorious Tomb by Guy Haley, provides a harrowing first-hand account of what it feels like to be trapped in a dreadnought, highlighting the profound loneliness and frustration that comes with this form of eternal service. Yet despite all this suffering, despite the torture of their existence, dreadnoughts continue to serve. They do not request deactivation, though some chapters would grant it. They do not turn from their duty, though every moment of consciousness is a reminder of what they have lost. Why? Because they are Space Marines, and Space Marines know only duty, only service, only faith in the Emperor and the mission he set before them 10,000 years ago. Their faith is the only thing that makes their existence bearable, the only anchor that keeps them from complete madness. It is this faith that we must understand if we are to comprehend why no Ork interrogation could ever shake it. The Fortress of the Mind, Space Marine Conditioning. To understand why a dreadnought cannot be broken by Ork torture, we must examine the psychological architecture of a Space Marine, the layers upon layers of mental conditioning that transform a mortal boy into the Emperor's Angel of Death. This is not mere training, not simple indoctrination. It is a fundamental rewiring of the human psyche, a process so thorough and so invasive that it calls into question whether the resulting being can even be considered the same person who entered the chapter's halls as an aspirant. The creation of a Space Marine begins with selection. Chapters draw their recruits from various sources, some choosing from feral tribes on death worlds, others from hive gangs, still others from martial cultures that have produced warriors for millennia. But regardless of source, all recruits share certain characteristics. They are young, usually between 10 and 14 years old, at an age when the mind is still malleable enough to be reshaped. They possess physical gifts that mark them as exceptional among their peers. And they have demonstrated qualities of courage, resilience, and dedication that suggest they might survive what is to come. What is to come is nothing short of a controlled obliteration of their previous identity. The process begins even before the first gene seed implantation, with intensive hypno-indoctrination sessions that use a combination of subliminal messaging, neurochemical manipulation, and direct psychic intervention by the chapter's librarians. These sessions implant not just knowledge, tactics, and doctrine, but fundamental alterations to how the recruit perceives reality itself. Hypno-indoctrination is a technology that dates back to pre-unification terror, refined over millennia to create perfect soldiers. During these sessions, the aspirant is exposed to mimetic packages, carefully crafted bundles of information and psychological conditioning designed to reshape thought patterns at their most fundamental level. Battle tactics are burned directly into their cortex. Weapons training bypasses conscious learning, becoming instinct. And most crucially, absolute obedience to the chapter and the emperor is hardwired into their very neural architecture. The effects of this conditioning are profound and, in many ways, terrifying. Memories of the recruit's pre-Astartes life become hazy and indistinct, their emotional significance stripped away. Who they were before, the child they had been, becomes little more than a ghost, an echo of someone else's existence. Natural emotional responses are suppressed or redirected. Sexuality is neutered. Fear of death is not eliminated. That would make them reckless. But it is subordinated to duty in a way that makes self-sacrifice not just acceptable, but desirable. The catalepsian node, one of the 19 gene seed organs implanted during the transformation process, makes Space Marines particularly susceptible to hypnotic suggestion. This wasn't an accident. The Emperor and his gene rights designed the Astartes creation process to produce warriors who could be rapidly conditioned and who would remain conditioned throughout their service. Some chapters are rumored to have developed keyword triggers, phrases that when spoken by chaplains ensure absolute obedience, similar to the control mechanisms used over sleeper agents. But hypno-indoctrination is only one layer of the psychological fortress built around a Space Marine's mind. On top of this foundation comes years of cultural and religious conditioning. The recruit is immersed in the chapter's traditions, learning not just their tactics and history, but their mythology, their understanding of their place in the Imperium and the cosmos. They are taught that they are no longer merely human, that they carry the Emperor's own genetic legacy in their gene seed. They become, in a very real sense, the Emperor's sons, warriors touched by divinity and set apart from the rest of humanity. This sense of being chosen, of being special and sacred, is reinforced constantly throughout a Space Marine's service. Chaplains serve as spiritual enforcers, leading prayers and conducting rituals that remind the warriors of their holy duty. Every battle is framed not merely as military necessity, but as a sacred act, a furtherance of the Emperor's will. Every fallen brother is honored not just as a lost comrade, but as a martyr who has ascended to the Emperor's side. The result of all this conditioning is a mind that is, by design, nearly impossible to break through conventional means. Space Marines cannot be bribed because they desire nothing beyond the opportunity to serve. They cannot be threatened with death because they embrace death as the ultimate fulfillment of their purpose. They cannot be turned against their brothers because brotherhood and loyalty are wired into their psyche at a level deeper than conscious thought. And they absolutely cannot be made to renounce or question the Emperor because the Emperor is the foundation upon which their entire existence is built. For a Dreadnought, this conditioning has had centuries to solidify. An ancient who has served in their walking tomb for hundreds of years has endured hardships that would break lesser beings 1,000 times over. They have watched their chapter evolve, seen brothers they trained with pass into legend, witnessed the Imperium's slow decay. Through all of this, faith in the Emperor has been the one constant, the only thing that never changes or diminishes. It is not merely belief anymore. It has become the very structure of their thought, the framework through which they understand reality itself. This is what Orks face when they capture a Dreadnought. Not a warrior who believes in the Emperor the way a human might believe in a religion or philosophy, but a being for whom the Emperor is as fundamental to their existence as gravity, as essential as the equations that govern physics. You might as well try to convince a fish that water doesn't exist. The cognitive dissonance would be too great. The Dreadnought's mind simply has no framework for processing such a concept. Moreover, the mental conditioning of a Space Marine includes specific defenses against interrogation and torture. They are trained to retreat into what are called pain mantras, mental exercises that allow them to distance their consciousness from physical suffering. They have psychic barriers implanted by librarians, wards against mind reading and psychic assault. Many chapters include training in resisting specific forms of torture, teaching their warriors to compartmentalize information and resist even the most sophisticated interrogation techniques. But even all of this doesn't fully explain the impossibility of breaking a dreadnought's faith through Ork methods. To truly understand why Orks cannot succeed where even master torturers might struggle, we must examine the nature of Orks themselves, their fundamental limitations as interrogators, and the ways in which their psychology makes them singularly ill-equipped for the task of breaking a mind that has already been shattered and rebuilt around an unshakable core of faith. The cultural chasm. Why Orks cannot comprehend faith. Beyond the psychological and technological barriers that prevent Orks from breaking a dreadnought's conditioning, there exists an even more fundamental problem: a complete cultural and philosophical incompatibility between Ork and Space Marine worldviews. To fully appreciate why Ork interrogation must fail, we need to understand not just what each side believes, but how profoundly different their entire frameworks for understanding reality truly are. Ork culture, if we can even call it that, is brutally simple and refreshingly honest in its simplicity. There is no pretense, no hidden agenda, no complex political maneuvering beyond, "I'm bigger than you, so I'm in charge until someone bigger comes along." When an Ork looks at the universe, they see it through a lens of immediate, visceral experience. Strong things are good because strength lets you win fights. Big things are impressive because big things can smash other things more effectively. Red things go faster, not because of aerodynamics or engine tuning, but because red is the color of speed, and that's just how it works. This worldview extends to how Orks understand motivation and behavior. When an Ork asks why another Ork does something, the answer is almost always rooted in immediate physical circumstances. Why did you attack that enemy? Because fighting is fun, and I wanted their loot. Why do you follow that war boss? Because he's the biggest and he'll crump me if I don't. Why do you paint your truck red? Because red ones go faster, obviously. These are not philosophical positions. They're statements of observable fact from an Ork perspective. Human motivations, and especially Space Marine motivations, don't fit into this framework at all. When a Space Marine charges into certain death to buy their brothers 30 seconds of escape time, an Ork might understand the tactics. The Ork might even respect the warrior's courage in their own way. But the underlying motivation, the absolute willingness to sacrifice oneself for others, for abstract concepts like duty and honor, this is deeply alien. Orks will die for their war boss, certainly, but that's because the war boss is right there being impressive and leading the fight. The idea of dying for an emperor who has been on a golden throne for 10,000 years, who has never spoken to you directly, who may or may not even be conscious in any meaningful sense, this is incomprehensible. Now consider faith specifically. When Orks worship Gork and Mork, their brutal and cunning gods, it's less worship in a religious sense, and more acknowledgement of a fact about the universe. Gork and Mork exist in the Ork understanding not as objects of devotion, but as archetypes, representations of the two paths to Orky excellence. You don't have faith in Gork and Mork in the way humans have faith in the Emperor. You just know they're there, the same way you know your chopper will cut things if you swing it right. This creates a profound disconnect when Orks attempt to interrogate a dreadnought. The questions they might think to ask reveal their complete misunderstanding of what drives their captive. Tell us where your boys are hiding. Why would this work? The dreadnought's loyalty to their battle brothers isn't based on fear or mutual benefit. It's wired into their neural architecture, reinforced by centuries of service. Betraying their chapter would be like trying to forget how to breathe. We'll let you go if you tell us about your weapons. Again, what leverage does this provide? The dreadnought doesn't want to go anywhere. Their purpose is to serve the Emperor in battle until they are finally destroyed. Being released by Orks just means finding their way back to Imperial lines to resume service. And why would they trade tactical information that might lead to more Astartes deaths for their own freedom? The entire offer is predicated on assumptions about motivation that simply don't apply. Your emperor abandoned you. You're trapped in this metal box forever. This might be the closest an orc comes to a psychological argument, but it fundamentally misunderstands how Space Marines conceptualize their service. The Dreadnought doesn't view their entombment as abandonment. They view it as the highest honor short of death in battle, a recognition that their experience and tactical acumen are too valuable to lose. Yes, the reality is horrific. Yes, many Dreadnoughts describe their existence as torture. But that suffering has meaning within their psychological framework. It's martyrdom, witness, service through pain. The Orc suggestion that this is abandonment doesn't plant seeds of doubt. It reveals the Xenos' complete failure to understand what they're dealing with. The communication barrier extends even to basic language. When a Dreadnought speaks of the Emperor, they're not just naming a historical figure. They're invoking a complex theological and philosophical concept that includes the Emperor as historical person, as psychic entity, as divine being, as symbol of humanity's potential, as the source of the Astartes gene seed, and therefore their genetic father, and as the ultimate authority whose will gives meaning to existence. All of this is compressed into the single word Emperor, and a Space Marine understands all these layers implicitly. When an Orc hears Emperor, they hear the name of the Humi boss, the big important git who tells other Humis what to do. That's it. The theological dimensions, the faith aspect, the psychological complexity, all of this goes completely over their heads. It's not that they're too stupid to understand, exactly. It's that their brains are simply not structured to care about or process that kind of abstraction. It's irrelevant to the immediate business of fighting and winning, so it doesn't register as important. This creates a situation where the Orc interrogator and the Dreadnought prisoner are having two completely different conversations without either side realizing it. The Orc thinks they're trying to extract tactical information from a captured enemy. The Dreadnought thinks they're bearing witness to the Emperor's glory in the face of Xenos corruption, fulfilling their duty even in captivity. Neither can communicate with the other in any meaningful way, because they don't share enough common conceptual ground. Imagine an Orc painboy attempting to break a Dreadnought through psychological torture. The painboy might try to create scenarios designed to induce despair. Your chapter is dead. We killed them all. But even if the Dreadnought believed this, which they almost certainly wouldn't without proof, the response wouldn't be despair. It would be renewed determination to avenge their fallen brothers and ensure their sacrifice meant something. The painboy has accidentally given the Dreadnought more motivation, not less. Or consider an attempt at offering temptation. We can make you strong again. We can give you a proper body. This reveals another fundamental misunderstanding. The Dreadnought doesn't want a proper body, or rather, they might want it in some abstract sense, but they subordinate that desire to duty so completely that the desire effectively doesn't exist. Offering them what they've sacrificed in service to the Emperor isn't temptation. It's an insult that suggests they don't really believe in what they're fighting for. The cultural chasm extends even to how each side conceptualizes time and endurance. Orcs live in the eternal now, focused on the current fight, the immediate challenge. They have memories and can learn from experience, but their planning rarely extends beyond, we'll go there and fight them next. The concept of a being who has served for 600 years, whose personal experience spans the rise and fall of entire imperial sectors, whose patience is measured in centuries rather than hours. This is beyond Orc comprehension. When an Orc tells a Dreadnought, "You've been in there for centuries, give up already," they think they're pointing out the futility of continued resistance. But the Dreadnought hears confirmation of their success. Yes, they've endured for centuries. Yes, they've continued to serve despite everything. This is proof of faith's strength, not evidence of its weakness. The Ork has inadvertently validated everything the Dreadnought believes about duty and endurance. There's also a fundamental difference in how each species processes and values pain. Orks feel pain, certainly, but it doesn't mean to them what it means to humans. Pain is just a signal that damage is occurring, and Orks are so tough that they can usually ignore it until the damage becomes critical. An Ork might lose an arm and think, well, that's annoying, guess I'll get a bionic one, and continue fighting, barely interrupted. Pain doesn't teach Orks lessons about vulnerability or mortality. It's just another part of fighting, like noise and smoke. Space Marines, despite their enhanced pain tolerance and mental conditioning, understand pain as humans do because they were human once. They know what it means to suffer, what it feels like to be broken and vulnerable. But they have been trained to recontextualize that suffering as meaningful, as part of service, as acceptable cost for duty fulfilled. When a Dreadnought experiences pain, they don't simply ignore it like an Ork might. They acknowledge it, accept it, and integrate it into their sense of martyrdom and purpose. This means when an Ork torturer inflicts pain, they're operating under the assumption that pain is just information about damage, and enough damage will make the prisoner want to stop being damaged and therefore cooperate. But the Dreadnought processes pain through an entirely different framework, where suffering in the Emperor's service is noble and meaningful. The torturer and the victim are using the same physical stimulus to reach opposite conclusions about what should happen next. The religious dimension of this disconnect cannot be overstated. Ork religion is transactional and immediate. You fight well, you get to be around other successful Orks. You accumulate loot and status. Gork and Mork might help you fight better, or they might not. But either way, you keep fighting because fighting is what Orks do. There's no salvation to achieve, no heaven to reach, no damnation to avoid. You fight until something kills you, and that's the whole story. Space Marine faith is infinitely more complex. It involves concepts of sin and redemption, of sacred duty and honor, of serving something greater than yourself. It includes beliefs about the Emperor watching over his servants, about the possibility of joining him after death, about the Imperium as a sacred trust to be defended against all enemies. It encompasses moral philosophy, tactical doctrine, historical tradition, and personal identity, all bound together into a single theological framework. When an Ork tries to attack this faith, they're like someone trying to demolish a cathedral using only a shovel. They can maybe chip away at some surface details, but they have no understanding of load-bearing walls, structural supports, or foundations. They don't even realize the building is complex enough to have those things. They just see walls and think walls can be broken, without understanding that this particular wall is part of a structure that will resist their efforts in ways they cannot predict or counter. The final element of this cultural chasm is perhaps the most damning for Ork interrogation efforts: the complete absence of sophisticated deception in Ork culture. Orks are straightforward to a fault. When they want something, they take it. When they're angry, they hit things. When they lie, it's usually so obvious that even other Orks can spot it. The concept of subtle manipulation, of planting ideas that will grow over time, of exploiting psychological vulnerabilities through carefully crafted scenarios. All of this requires a level of social sophistication that Ork culture simply does not develop. This means that even if an Ork somehow understood what they needed to do to break a Dreadnought's conditioning, they would lack the skill to actually do it. It would be like asking someone who has only ever used a sledgehammer to perform microsurgery. The tools are wrong, the skills are absent, and the basic understanding of what the task requires is completely missing. The cultural gap between Ork and Astartes is not a bridge that can be crossed with enough effort. It's a fundamental incompatibility that makes any meaningful psychological manipulation impossible from the start. This cultural chasm dooms Ork interrogation efforts before they even begin. The questions they ask reveal their ignorance. The tools they use demonstrate their misunderstanding. The very framework through which they approach the problem guarantees failure because they are trying to solve a psychological puzzle using physical solutions, trying to break a faith they cannot comprehend, using methods that presuppose motivations their captive does not possess. It is, in every sense, an exercise in futility driven by Ork confidence that everything can be solved by sufficient application of violence and volume. Orks are, in many ways, the perfect enemy for Space Marines to face. They are numerous beyond counting, scattered across every corner of the galaxy. They are physically powerful, rivaling and sometimes exceeding Astartes in raw strength. They are tough almost beyond belief, capable of surviving injuries that would instantly kill lesser beings. They regenerate from wounds with remarkable speed, and they feel pain so differently from humans that it barely slows them down. And perhaps most importantly, they love fighting with a pure, uncomplicated joy that makes them endlessly dangerous. But for all their strengths as warriors, Orks possess critical weaknesses when it comes to the subtle arts of interrogation and psychological manipulation. To understand why Orks cannot break a Dreadnaught's faith, we must understand not just what Orks are, but what they fundamentally are not. Orks are a fungal species, engineered millions of years ago by the Old Ones, to serve as warriors in a war so ancient that most of the galaxy has forgotten it even occurred. Their biology is remarkable in its efficiency. They reproduce through spores, creating entire ecosystems wherever they go. They possess genetic memory, instinctive knowledge of how to build weapons, and wage war without needing to be taught. And they generate a Gestalt psychic field, a collective unconscious that makes their ramshackle technology work, and their belief literally shape reality in small but significant ways. This psychic field, known as the WH, is central to understanding Ork psychology. All Orks contribute to this field, and all are affected by it. It allows them to instinctively recognize who is bigger, and therefore in charge. It makes their crudely built weapons function despite barely having any right to work. It even affects reality itself in minor ways, like making their vehicles go faster when painted red, simply because Orks believe red ones should go faster. The WAG field grows stronger as more Orks gather together. A lone Ork is dangerous, but relatively simple, operating on base instincts and crude reasoning. But when thousands or millions of Orks congregate under a powerful war boss, something changes. The collective field becomes so strong that it can affect the Orks themselves, making them larger, stronger, and even slightly more intelligent. The biggest WAGs in history have produced Orks of terrifying capability, like the Beast, whose forces nearly brought down the Imperium in the 32nd Millennium. But here's the critical limitation. The WAG field affects reality and Ork psychology, but it does not grant Orks genuine understanding of non-Ork minds. Orks understand violence because violence is their nature. They understand hierarchy because their psychic field is built around recognizing who is strongest. They understand basic tactics because they possess genetic memory of warfare. But they do not understand subtlety. They do not understand psychology in any sophisticated sense. And they absolutely do not understand faith of the kind that drives a Space Marine. When Orks take prisoners, which they occasionally do, it is rarely for interrogation in any meaningful sense. Most often, captives become slaves, forced to labor until they die of exhaustion, or are casually killed when they're no longer useful. Some are kept as entertainment, subjected to beatings and torture, not to extract information, but simply because the Orks find their suffering amusing. A few might be questioned in the most basic way: where is the loot? Or, where are more humies to fight? But sophisticated interrogation, the kind that might break a trained soldier's will or extract detailed intelligence, is simply beyond Ork capability. This limitation stems from fundamental aspects of Ork psychology. First, Orks lack patience. They exist in the moment, driven by immediate desires and impulses. The idea of conducting a prolonged interrogation, carefully breaking down a prisoner's resistance over weeks or months, is antithetical to Ork nature. They want answers now, and if they don't get them, they're more likely to just smash the prisoner and move on to something more interesting. Second, Orks lack empathy and have virtually no theory of mind for other species. They don't really understand that other beings think differently than they do. When an Ork interrogates someone, they approach it from an Ork perspective, hit the prisoner until they talk, or threaten to hit them harder. The concept that different species might have different pain thresholds, different psychological breaking points, different values that could be exploited, these are beyond Ork comprehension. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Orks don't really understand the concept of information having value beyond its immediate tactical application. An Ork might understand asking a prisoner, "Where are your boys hiding?" because knowing that lets them find more enemies to fight. But trying to get a prisoner to reveal their beliefs, their motivations, their command structure in detail, why would an Ork care about such things? It doesn't lead directly to more fighting, so it holds no interest. The role of pain boys in Ork society illustrates these limitations perfectly. Pain boys are the Ork equivalent of doctors and surgeons, driven by an insatiable curiosity about how living bodies work. They conduct experimental surgeries, attach crude bionics, and generally tinker with flesh the way mech boys tinker with machinery. When pain boys capture enemies, they absolutely do subject them to horrific torture, vivisecting them without anesthetic, transforming them into cybernetic monstrosities, or simply pulling them apart to see how the pieces fit together. But this torture is not strategic. It's not designed to break the will or extract information. Pain boys conduct their experiments because they're curious, because they enjoy the work, because it's what they're genetically driven to do. If they learn something useful, that's a bonus, but it's not the goal. A pain boy might capture a space marine to study their enhanced physiology, to figure out how their multi-lung system works, or whether their progenoid glands can be used to make tougher Orks. But getting the space marine to talk about the Emperor, why would a pain boy even think to try? Moreover, Orks fundamentally do not understand the concept of unshakable faith. Ork religion is simple and direct. They worship Gork and Mork, their brutal and cunning gods, but this worship is matter of fact, not a deep spiritual commitment. Orks don't have religious doubt. They don't have faith that sustains them through hardship. They just believe in Gork and Mork the same way they believe the sky is up and the ground is down, as a simple fact of existence. The idea that, someone could have faith so strong it trumps survival instinct, so deep it cannot be shaken even by the worst suffering, this is completely alien to Ork psychology. This brings us to a crucial realization. When Orks capture a Dreadnought and attempt to interrogate it, they are bringing the wrong tools to an impossible job. It's like trying to hack a computer with a sledgehammer. The sledgehammer might be very effective at certain tasks. It can definitely destroy the computer, but it cannot be used for anything requiring precision or understanding. Orks can hurt a Dreadnought. They can damage its systems, torture what remains of the body within, but they cannot break the faith that sustains it, because they lack the psychological tools to even understand what that faith is, let alone how to undermine it. Physical torture and its futility. Let us now turn to the specific scenario of Ork torture, and why it would inevitably fail when applied to a captured Dreadnought. To do this, we must confront some grim realities about both the nature of Ork torture and the already tortured existence of a space marine entombed in a walking sarcophagus. This is not pleasant subject matter, but understanding the specifics helps illuminate why the Ork approach is doomed from the start. When Orks do engage in torture, and they certainly do on occasion, it tends to be crude and direct. They might beat a prisoner, starve them, or subject them to the attentions of a pain boy who will conduct invasive surgeries without anesthetic. They might threaten the prisoner with increasingly violent ends, or simply hurt them in creative ways to see what happens. For baseline humans, or even moderately trained soldiers, these methods can be terrifyingly effective. The threat of having limbs removed, of being vivisected while conscious, of being transformed into some hideous cybernetic experiment. These are horrors that can break even strong wills. But consider what these methods would mean when applied to a dreadnought. The being trapped inside that armored sarcophagus is not a normal human. It's not even a normal space marine anymore. It's a fragment of a warrior, sustained by technology, who has already endured torments that make most Ork torture look gentle by comparison. Let's examine specific scenarios. Imagine the Orks have successfully pried open part of the dreadnought's sarcophagus, exposing the withered flesh within. The sight that greets them is horrifying even by Ork standards. A human body reduced to its essential components. Atrophied limbs no thicker than a child's arms. Skin that has not seen real light in centuries turned pale and translucent. Organs visible through semi-transparent tissue. The body floats in thick amniotic fluid. Cables and tubes penetrating flesh at dozens of points. Neural interface ports creating constellations of scar tissue across what remains of the torso. A pain boy approaches with his crude surgical implements, eager to begin his experimental vivisection. The first cut draws no reaction beyond a slight change in the dreadnought's vital signs, barely noticeable on monitoring equipment, if the Orks even knew how to read it. The Space Marine's enhanced physiology means that even this withered flesh is more resilient than normal human tissue. The Laraman's organ immediately begins clotting the wound, specialized cells rushing to seal the breach. The pain boy has to cut deeper, harder, fighting against biology designed to survive almost anything. But even as the pain boy works, cutting into muscle and scraping against enhanced bone structure, the dreadnought's mechanical voice continues its litany. There is no screaming, no begging for mercy, just the steady recitation of imperial prayers and denunciations of Xenos corruption. The pain boy might find this unsettling, this complete absence of the reactions he's used to eliciting. When you torture a Gretchen, it screams and begs. When you torture a human, they eventually break down, pleading for death. But this thing in the metal box simply continues talking about its emperor, as though the torture were merely an inconvenience. The pain boy might escalate, attempting to inflict more severe damage. Perhaps he removes one of the atrophied limbs entirely, sawing through bone with crude instruments. The dreadnought doesn't need that limb anyway, has not needed it for centuries. The actual physical impact is negligible. But the psychological impact the pain boy hopes for never materializes. Instead, the dreadnought might actually express something like satisfaction. Yes, Xenos, take what little remains of my flesh. It means nothing. I am beyond such concerns now. I am a weapon in the Emperor's hands, and you cannot disarm me with your crude butchery. Let's consider another scenario: electrical torture. Perhaps the Orks attach their crude zappers and shock prods directly to the neural interface ports, sending jolts of electricity through the systems that connect the dreadnought's brain to their mechanical body. This should, in theory, be agonizing, the kind of pain that overrides all conscious thought. And indeed, it would cause intense suffering. The neural pathways would light up with pain signals, the brain flooding with stress hormones. But Space Marines have been trained to function through exactly this kind of pain. Some chapters, particularly the Imperial Fists, use nerve induction as part of their regular devotional practices. The pain glove ritual subjects initiates to hours of electrical stimulation designed to teach them to function while their entire nervous system screams. A dreadnought from such a chapter would recognize this torture as familiar, almost comforting in its familiarity. Ah, the ancient might think, this is like the pain glove, but administered by incompetent Xenos instead of skilled chaplains. I have endured this and worse in the Emperor's name. The psychological conditioning of Space Marines includes specific techniques for dealing with pain, techniques that the Orks have no knowledge of and no counter for. Pain mantras allow the Marine to distance their consciousness from the physical sensations. They observe the pain as though it were happening to someone else, maintain mental clarity even while their body suffers. Some chapters teach their initiates to welcome pain as a reminder that they are alive, as proof that they continue to serve. Every jolt of electricity, every cut of the knife, becomes not evidence of vulnerability, but confirmation of endurance. Moreover, the Dreadnought's normal existence involves pain on a level that most beings cannot imagine enduring for minutes, let alone centuries. The neural connection ports cause constant low-level pain as organic tissue interfaces with inorganic systems. The amniotic fluid is numbingly cold, according to lore, a discomfort that never ends. The psychological stress of isolation and sensory deprivation creates mental anguish that physical torture cannot match. The slow deterioration of memory and identity, the watching of centuries pass while trapped in an unchanging existence. This is torture on a level that makes cutting and burning seem almost quaint. When orcs attempt to inflict suffering on such a being, they are trying to add water to an ocean. Yes, technically they are increasing the total amount of suffering, but the increase is so small relative to what the Dreadnought already endures that it makes no practical difference. The ancient warrior has spent 300 years in a state of existence that any normal being would consider a fate worse than death. What can the orcs possibly do that compares to that? What new torment can they invent that exceeds the horror of waking from dreamless sleep to find that 50 years have passed, that brothers you trained with are long dead, that the galaxy has changed in ways both small and vast, while you remained frozen in time? There's also the simple logistics of orc torture to consider. Pain boys are enthusiastic in their work, certainly, but they lack precision and, crucially, any understanding of space marine biology beyond they're tough. When a pain boy cuts into a Dreadnought's occupant, he's working blind, not knowing which organs are augmented, which systems are critical, which injuries might actually kill the subject. This creates a real risk that the pain boy accidentally destroys something vital, killing the Dreadnought before any useful information could theoretically be extracted. And what happens if the torture does kill the Dreadnought? The orcs lose their captive without gaining anything. There is no afterlife interrogation, no way to continue the process with a corpse. The whole endeavor becomes pointless, a waste of time and effort that yielded nothing but Xenos satisfaction at having destroyed an enemy, which, to be fair, is often enough for orcs. But if the goal was actually to extract information or break faith, death represents complete failure. Consider also the possibility of sensory deprivation, one of the most effective forms of psychological torture when applied to normal humans. The orcs might think to isolate the Dreadnought completely, cutting off all external stimuli, leaving the ancient warrior alone with their thoughts in absolute darkness and silence. This would be horrifying to a baseline human, would drive most people insane within days or weeks. But the Dreadnought already experiences something very much like sensory deprivation every time they are placed in stasis between battles. The void of unconscious sleep, the complete absence of sensory input, the isolation so profound that time itself loses meaning. This is not new. It is the normal state of existence between periods of service. When orcs inflict sensory deprivation, they are giving the Dreadnought what they already receive as standard practice between deployments. The ancient might actually find it restful compared to being tortured, a return to familiar emptiness. What about starvation? Orcs might think to cut off nutrient supply, letting the Dreadnought's withered body consume itself. But the life support systems are designed to sustain the occupant indefinitely on minimal resources. The Space Marine's enhanced metabolism can endure starvation far longer than normal humans. And again, the psychological impact is minimal. The Dreadnought does not fear death through starvation. They do not particularly fear death at all. Death would be release, an end to centuries of suffering, reunion with the Emperor. Threatening a Dreadnought with death is like threatening a drowning man with a life preserver. Perhaps the orcs try psychological torture through threats to things the Dreadnought cares about. Tell us about your chapter, or will kill this captured human. But this reveals yet another gap in Ork understanding. First, why would a Space Marine care deeply about a random human they've never met? Space Marines protect humanity in the abstract, certainly, but individual humans are beneath their notice beyond their strategic value. Second, even if the human were someone significant, a chapter serf or a remembrancer who traveled with the company, the calculus doesn't change. The Dreadnought would not trade tactical information that might endanger their entire chapter for one life, no matter how valued. We'll destroy your armor, melt it down for scrap. Again, this misunderstands Space Marine psychology. The armor is revered, certainly, but it's not the Dreadnought's identity. It's a tool, a sacred tool, but ultimately replaceable. The chapter has the ability to build new Dreadnought chassis if needed. What matters is the warrior inside, their experience and knowledge. Destroying the armor just means the chapter will eventually build a new one to house their ancient when he's recovered. Every approach the Orks might try runs into the same fundamental problem. They are attempting to leverage things the Kaishin Dreadnought either doesn't care about, doesn't fear, or actively welcomes. Death, welcome as release. Pain, already experiencing it constantly. Humiliation, impossible to humiliate a being who has transcended concern for their physical form. Isolation, their normal state. Threats to others, overridden by duty. Promises of reward. Nothing the Orks can offer competes with the promise of serving the Emperor. The futility extends even to the few forms of torture that might theoretically affect a Space Marine. Threatening the chapter's gene seed, promising to corrupt it or destroy it, might cause genuine distress. But the gene seed is already extracted and preserved separately. The Dreadnought doesn't carry it, so the Orks have no leverage there. Threatening to desecrate the fallen, to defile the bodies of the Dreadnought's battle brothers, might cause anger, but not cooperation. It would more likely inspire renewed resistance, determination that the Xenos will pay for their blasphemy. The inescapable conclusion is that Ork torture methods, designed for immediate physical results against beings who can be broken through suffering, are completely inadequate when faced with a Dreadnought. The ancient warrior has already sacrificed everything that makes life worth living for most beings. They have endured centuries of isolation, degradation, and pain. Their existence is defined by suffering for a purpose they consider sacred. Adding more suffering doesn't break their will. It validates it. Every moment of torture becomes another test passed, another proof of faith, another demonstration that even the worst the galaxy can throw at them cannot shake their devotion to the Emperor of mankind. The field and its limitations. We must now address a question that might occur to those familiar with Ork lore. What about the field? Orks possess a gestalt psychic ability that literally warps reality to match their collective belief. Could this power be used to break a Dreadnought's conditioning, to make the ancient warrior doubt or renounce their faith? The answer, despite the field's remarkable properties, is almost certainly no. To understand why, we need to examine both what the field can and cannot do, and how it interacts with other forms of psychic phenomena and mental conditioning. The field is, without question, one of the most peculiar psychic phenomena in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. It is not like the discrete psychic powers wielded by Eldar Farseers or human-sanctioned psychers. It is not channeled consciously or directed with precision. Instead, it is a passive, gestalt effect created by the collective unconscious of all Orks in a given area. The more Orks present, the stronger the field becomes, and the more pronounced its reality-warping effects. These effects are well documented in Imperial records. Ork vehicles painted red genuinely do go faster because Orks believe they should. Weapons that have no right to function, cobbled together from scrap metal and barely held together by crude welding, fire reliably because Orks believe they will. Ammunition of mismatched calibers, chambers and fires from Ork guns because the wielder believes it should fit. In extreme cases, during the largest WH40Ks, reality itself seems to bend to Ork expectations, producing outcomes that defy conventional physics. However, and this is crucial, the WH40K field has significant limitations. It does not grant Orks unlimited reality warping power. It cannot make literally anything true just because Orks believe it. The field works primarily by making crude technology function despite its inadequacies, and by producing minor probabilistic effects that favor Ork expectations. It is not a tool for sophisticated mental manipulation or direct psychic assault on other minds. The Adeptus Mechanicus has debated for millennia whether Ork technology genuinely requires the WH40K field to function, or whether it's simply so crude that it works in the hands of Orks, but fails when used by other species who lack the instinctive knowledge to operate it. Records from Imperial Guard units using captured Ork equipment confirm that Orkish technology is functional, if extremely unreliable, even without Orks present. This suggests the WH40K field enhances and stabilizes Ork technology rather than making it work from nothing. When it comes to affecting other minds, the WH40K field's capabilities are even more limited. It influences Orks themselves, allowing them to instinctively recognize hierarchy and respond to the presence of a powerful war boss. It can affect the morale of enemy troops, creating a palpable aura of menace during Ork charges. But it does not directly rewrite the thoughts or beliefs of non-Orks. If it did, Orks would never lose battles because they could simply believe their enemies into submission. More importantly, the WH40K field operates on a level fundamentally different from the hypno-conditioning and mental architecture of a space marine. The conditioning that shapes an Astartes is not based on belief in the way that Ork reality warping is. It is neurological, chemical, and in some cases, psychic, but it is installed in the individual mind through direct intervention, not maintained by collective belief. Think of it this way: the WH40K field is like a background radiation that affects how probability works in a localized area. Space Marine conditioning is like a firewall installed on a computer's operating system. The background radiation might affect electronics in the area, might cause some systems to behave erratically, but it cannot directly hack through security protocols that were specifically designed to resist intrusion. The two phenomena operate on different levels of reality. Additionally, Space Marines, and especially Dreadnoughts, have psychic defenses installed by their chapter's librarians. These are not passive protections, but active wards, designed to resist chaos corruption, psychic assault, and mental manipulation. While these defenses are primarily intended to guard against chaos sorcery and demonic possession, they would likely provide some protection against any crude psychic attempts to affect the Marine's thoughts. There's also a fundamental compatibility issue. The WH40K field works by reinforcing Ork beliefs and making reality conform to Ork expectations. But Orks don't really have a coherent belief about Space Marines beyond they're tough enemies who give a good fight. They certainly don't have a specific belief that captured Space Marines should renounce the Emperor. Such a concept is too abstract, too divorced from immediate physical reality, for the WH40K field to latch onto and reinforce. Even if we imagine a scenario where a truly massive WH40K, billions of Orks strong, directed their collective psychic field toward making a Dreadnought betray the Emperor, the nature of belief itself creates an insurmountable problem. The WH40K field works by making what Orks believe become true, but the foundation of Space Marine faith is that the Emperor is the absolute truth, the master of mankind, the only hope for humanity's survival. These are not beliefs that can be unmade by counterbelief. They are so fundamental to the Space Marine's consciousness that to remove them would be to destroy the identity itself. It would be like trying to use the WH40K field to make a fish believe that water doesn't exist, or to make a human believe they don't need oxygen. Even if the field could somehow impose such a belief, the result wouldn't be conversion or doubt. It would be immediate psychological collapse, the complete breakdown of a mind that has no framework for processing such a fundamental negation of its reality. This brings us to an interesting thought experiment. What if, instead of trying to break the Dreadnought's faith, the Orks simply believed the Dreadnought was telling them everything they wanted to know? Would the WH field make that true? The answer is probably no, and here's why. The WH field affects reality primarily in ways that are already physically possible, but improbable, or that involve making crude technology work despite its flaws. It makes red vehicles go faster, but they don't teleport across the battlefield. It makes mismatched ammunition fire, but it doesn't turn bullets into las beams. The field bends reality, but doesn't break it. A Dreadnought either has information or doesn't. Either is willing to share it or isn't. These are facts about the Dreadnought's mental state and knowledge base, not probabilities that can be nudged in the Ork's favor. The WH field can make it more likely that a slightly damaged weapon will fire when an Ork needs it to. It cannot make a being who fundamentally does not want to cooperate suddenly decide to betray their most sacred oaths. Furthermore, we must consider the reality that Dreadnoughts and Space Marines in general represent one of the Imperium's most effective countermeasures against Ork waggers. Throughout 10,000 years of history, Space Marines have defeated countless Ork invasions. They have killed war bosses, broken wags, and cleansed planets of greenskin infestations. If the wag field could affect Space Marine psychology in a meaningful way, these victories would be far less common. The truth is that the Imperium has developed its warriors specifically to resist the kinds of threats they face, and Ork psychic influence is one of those threats. The mental conditioning of a Space Marine, the layers of hypno-indoctrination and psychic warding, create a mind that is remarkably resilient against external mental influence. This is necessary because they fight enemies far more psychically capable than Orks. Chaos sorcerers, Eldar warlocks, Tyranid synapse creatures, Tau ethereals. If a Space Marine can resist a Chaos sorcerer actively trying to corrupt their thoughts, can maintain their faith while fighting in the heart of the Imperium itself, then the passive background psychic radiation of a WAG field is unlikely to affect them in any meaningful way. And a Dreadnought, who has potentially fought in hundreds of battles over centuries of service, has already proven their psychological resilience time and time again. What would actually happen? Having examined all the theoretical reasons why Orks cannot break a Dreadnought's faith, let us now consider what would actually happen if Orks captured such a prize. This scenario, while rare in the lore, provides insight into both the limitations of Ork psychology and the inhuman resolve of the Adeptus Astartes. The capture itself would be unlikely under most circumstances. Space Marines fight to recover fallen Dreadnoughts, treating their retrieval as a sacred duty second only to recovering gene seed from fallen brothers. The armored sarcophagus containing the ancient warrior is a holy relic, and the knowledge and experience within are too valuable to abandon. Entire companies of Space Marines have fought to the death to prevent a Dreadnought from falling into enemy hands. But war is chaos, and sometimes the impossible happens. Perhaps the Dreadnought fell in a rear-guard action, buying time for their brothers to escape an overwhelming Ork horde. Perhaps they were separated from their forces during a fighting retreat and surrounded before reinforcements could arrive. Perhaps they were disabled by lucky shots that compromised their motive systems, leaving them immobile on a battlefield that was soon overrun. Whatever the specific circumstances, let us imagine the Orks have succeeded in capturing their prize. The initial Ork reaction would be one of jubilation. They've captured a massive, heavily armed walker, the kind of war machine that mech boys dream about. Immediately, disputes would break out over who gets to keep it. The war boss, who led the warband that made the Petor, capture would claim it. Mech boys would argue they should get it to study and reverse engineer. Pain boys would insist they need it for medical experimentation. These disputes might devolve into violence, with Orks fighting each other over possession of the prize, even as it's being dragged back to their settlement. Eventually, some hierarchy of Ork authority would prevail, probably with the biggest orc claiming ultimate ownership while allowing various specialists to examine the Dreadnought. This is where things would start to go wrong for the Orks, because they would quickly discover that their prize is not what they thought it was. Mech boys, attempting to understand the Dreadnought's technology, would be frustrated by its sophistication. Ork technology works through a combination of crude engineering and the WAG field's reality warping effects. Dreadnoughts are examples of some of the finest technology the Imperium can produce, built with precision that mech boys simply cannot comprehend or replicate. The intricate life support systems, the neural interface technology, the ammunition feeds and targeting computers, all of these would be beyond Ork understanding. Moreover, the Dreadnought's machine spirit, the fragment of artificial intelligence or holy essence, depending on which imperial doctrine you follow, that helps coordinate its systems, would likely be actively hostile to Ork attempts at interface. The Adeptus Mechanicus builds loyalty to the Emperor into the very code of their creations. Even if the mech boys could figure out how to access the Dreadnought systems, which is doubtful, those systems would resist cooperation with Xenos users. Frustrated with the technology, the Orks might turn their attention to the occupant. Prying open or cutting into the sarcophagus would reveal the withered remains of the Space Marine within, floating in their amniotic cocoon. This is where Pain Boys would become involved, eager to study this strange hybrid of flesh and machine. The Pain Boys' examination would likely begin with curiosity and end in frustration. The Space Marine's modified biology would be fascinating at first. Multiple organs, enhanced bone structure, chemical glands that don't exist in normal humans. But as the Pain Boy attempted to vivisect their subject, they would encounter problems. Space Marine flesh is remarkably resilient. The Laraman's organ causes wounds to seal almost instantly. The os modular makes bones incredibly difficult to cut. The sheer toughness of Astartes' physiology means even Ork implements, while crude and brutal, might struggle to damage what they want to study. And all the while, the Dreadnought would be speaking, not screaming, not begging, but preaching. The mechanical voice would echo through the Ork workshop, proclaiming the glory of the Emperor, denouncing the Xenos filth, promising the inevitable retribution that would come when the chapter discovered what had happened to their ancient. This is where Ork psychology would truly fail them. The monologue from the Dreadnought would not be the kind of thing Orks could understand or engage with meaningfully. It would be full of concepts like duty, faith, honor, sacrifice, none of which have Ork equivalents. The Pain Boy might try to make the talking stop by damaging voxcasters or severing vocal cords, but this would only eliminate the possibility of extracting any information. Not that the Orks knew what questions to ask in the first place. As the torture continued and yielded nothing of value, Ork interest would begin to wane. Orks have short attention spans, driven by immediate gratification and the desire for exciting fights. A prisoner who won't fight back, won't beg for mercy, won't do anything interesting except spout incomprehensible religious rhetoric, quickly becomes boring. The novelty of having captured a Space Marine war machine would wear off as the reality set in. They couldn't make it work, couldn't get useful information from its occupant, and couldn't even get satisfying reactions to their torture. Different Orks would likely try different approaches. A Nob might try straightforward intimidation. "Tell us where the other Space Marines are or we'll kill ya." The Dreadnought's response would probably be something like, "My brothers will come for me, and when they do, your miserable existence will end in holy fire. Tell me, Xenos, have you made your peace with your primitive gods? You should." This kind of response, simultaneously contemptuous and fearless, would only confuse and anger the Ork, who lacks the psychological tools to understand what makes the prisoner so defiant. A particularly cunning Ork, perhaps a blood axe who has had more contact with humans, might try a different tactic, offering the Dreadnought something in exchange for cooperation. "We'll fix you up, make you all proper again, if you tell us what we want to know." But what could Orks possibly offer that a Space Marine would want? Freedom? A Dreadnought has no desire for freedom from their duty. Comfort? Comfort is irrelevant to one whose existence is already defined by suffering. Revenge against their chapter for entombing them? The very suggestion would be so absurd that the Dreadnought might actually laugh, a harsh mechanical sound that would echo from their vox casters. As days stretched into weeks, the Orks would grow increasingly frustrated. Some might advocate for simply destroying the Dreadnought, smashing it to bits and being done with the whole confusing mess. Others might suggest using it for target practice or some kind of entertainment. A few might hold out hope that eventually, the right combination of torture and threats would yield results. But here's what the Orks cannot understand and never will. Every moment of captivity only strengthens the Dreadnought's resolve. Every torture session becomes another trial endured in the Emperor's name. Every threat ignored is another proof of their faith. The psychological framework that sustains Space Marines is specifically designed to interpret suffering as validation. They are martyrs, witnesses to the Imperial truth, enduring all hardship for the sake of humanity. The Orks, by torturing them, are not breaking this narrative. They are reinforcing it. Eventually, one of several endings would occur. Perhaps a rescue mission would arrive, Space Marines fighting through Ork lines to reclaim their honored ancient. Perhaps the Orks would face some new threat or opportunity that drew their attention away, and the Dreadnought would be abandoned in some corner of their settlement, left to slowly die as life support systems failed. Perhaps the Orks would finally lose all interest and destroy the Dreadnought in a fit of frustration, granting the ancient warrior the death they had been denied for centuries. Or perhaps, in the darkest and most grimly fitting ending, the Dreadnought would simply outlast Ork interest. Left in some corner of a workshop, systems slowly failing, the Ancient would spend their final weeks or months continuing to serve the Emperor in the only way remaining to them, by praying. The mechanical voice would grow weaker as power systems degraded. The litanies might become confused as neural degradation accelerated. But even in their final moments, as consciousness fled for the last time, the Dreadnought would be thinking of the Emperor, of duty, of faith maintained until the absolute end. In every scenario, the Orks fail to achieve their objective if that objective involves making the Dreadnought betray or even question their faith. They fail because they are trying to solve a psychological problem with physical tools. They fail because they lack the patience, understanding, and subtle cruelty necessary for sophisticated mental torture. Most of all, they fail because they are up against something they cannot comprehend. Faith so absolute that it transcends reason, backed by conditioning so deep that it forms the very foundation of the captive's identity. Why others might succeed. Where Orks fail to truly appreciate the specific ways in which Orks are unsuited to breaking a Dreadnought's faith, it helps to consider how other factions in the Warhammer 40,000 universe might approach this task and why their methods would stand a better chance of success, however slight. The Dark Eldar, those twisted denizens of Komorach, who have made an art form of torture and soul consumption, would approach a captured Dreadnought very differently than Orks. Homunculi, the flesh sculptors of Dark Eldar society, possess medical and biological knowledge that dwarfs anything the Imperium has retained. They understand pain in ways that go beyond physical sensation, have mapped the neural pathways of agony across 1,000 species, and have developed techniques to keep subjects alive and aware through tortures that should kill them instantly. A homunculus attempting to break a Dreadnought would not simply inflict pain. They would use precision instruments to stimulate specific nerve clusters, creating symphonies of suffering carefully calibrated to overwhelm the Marines' pain mantras and mental conditioning. They would employ exotic chemicals and toxins to undermine the neurological barriers Space Marines rely on. Most insidiously, they would use their understanding of psychology to attack the foundation of the Marines' faith, asking questions designed to plant seeds of doubt, creating scenarios where the captive's beliefs seem to contradict themselves. Moreover, Dark Eldar have access to psychic abilities and soul manipulation that could theoretically bypass many of Space Marine's mental defenses. A sufficiently skilled homunculus might not try to break the Dreadnought's faith directly, but instead rewrite their memories, creating false recollections of the Emperor betraying the chapter, or the chapter betraying its ideals. This kind of sophisticated mental manipulation would be orders of magnitude more effective than anything Orks could attempt. Chaos forces, particularly those dedicated to Slaanesh or Tzeentch, would use entirely different approaches. Rather than torture, they might offer the Dreadnought what they have been denied: sensation, power, freedom from duty. Slaaneshi cultists could promise an end to the numbness of sarcophagus existence, the return of all the sensory experiences the Marine has lost. Tzeentchian sorcerers might offer knowledge, the answers to questions that have plagued the ancient during their centuries of service. More insidiously, chaos corruption often works by exploiting existing doubts and resentments. A chaos interrogator wouldn't try to convince a Dreadnought that the Emperor doesn't exist or doesn't deserve worship. Instead, they might ask why. If the Emperor truly cares about his warriors, he allows them to suffer so profoundly. Why entomb a loyal servant in a walking tomb rather than grant them the peace of death? Isn't perpetual service without end a kind of damnation rather than honor? These arguments would still likely fail against a properly conditioned Space Marine, but they at least address the psychological reality of the captive's existence. They engage with the faith on its own terms, rather than simply trying to bludgeon it into submission. Chaos forces understand that breaking a mind requires understanding how that mind works, what it fears, what it desires, what contradictions might exist between its stated beliefs and its lived experience. The Inquisition, when dealing with potentially corrupted or compromised Space Marines, uses yet another approach: mind wiping and reconditioning. Rather than trying to break a Marine's will through torture, they would use a combination of psychoviral agents, electrochemical intervention, and psychic manipulation to literally erase portions of the subject's memories and rebuild their personality from the ground up. This process, called mind scrubbing, or the death of self, can turn even a heretic back into a loyal servant, though whether the resulting individual is truly the same person is a matter of philosophical debate. The Inquisition's approach would be far more effective against a Dreadnought than Ork methods because it is based on understanding and precision rather than crude force. Inquisitors have access to technology and expertise that can actually affect the neurological and psychological basis of faith. They don't try to convince the subject to betray their beliefs. They simply remove those beliefs and replace them with new ones. Even the Tau, despite their relative lack of experience with Space Marines, would likely be more effective than Orks at psychological manipulation. The Tau philosophy of the greater good is designed to appeal to rational self-interest and communal benefit. While it would probably fail against a Space Marine's faith-based convictions, Tau watercast diplomats would at least understand the concept of trying to change someone's mind through persuasion rather than pain. The key insight from all these comparisons is that successful mental manipulation requires three things. Orks fundamentally lack understanding of the target's psychology, patience to implement long-term strategies, and tools sophisticated enough to affect the neurological basis of belief and conditioning. The Dark Eldar have all three. Chaos forces have at least the first 2+ supernatural power. The Inquisition has specialized technology and expertise. The Tau have sophisticated psychological theory, even if they lack experience with Space Marines specifically. Orks have none of these advantages. They don't understand Space Marine psychology because they don't really understand psychology in general. They lack patience because their entire species is driven by immediate gratification and the desire for constant action, and their tools are crude by design, built for direct physical action rather than subtle manipulation. This creates an interesting dynamic. In many ways, Orks are among the most dangerous enemies the Imperium faces. They are numerous, resilient, and can match Space Marines in direct combat. But when it comes to the psychological warfare, to breaking minds rather than bodies, they are perhaps the least equipped of all major factions. Their strength, their directness and simplicity becomes a critical weakness in any scenario requiring subtlety or patience. A Dreadnought captured by Dark Eldar might eventually break, their conditioning unable to withstand millennia-refined torture techniques and soul manipulation. A Dreadnought exposed to chaos corruption might, however unlikely, fall prey to whispered temptations and existential questions about the nature of their servitude. A Dreadnought subjected to inquisitorial mind-wiping might emerge as a blank slate, their old identity erased. But a Dreadnought captured by Orks, they will endure until death or rescue, their faith unshaken, because the Orks simply don't have the ability to do what breaking such faith would require. It's not that the Dreadnought is impervious to all attempts at mental manipulation. It's that the Orks are using the wrong tools, asking the wrong questions, and fundamentally misunderstanding the nature of what they're trying to break. The deeper meaning, faith versus simplicity. The scenario of Orks attempting to break a Dreadnought's faith illuminates something profound about the Warhammer 40,000 universe. It is a cosmos where different forms of power exist in fundamental opposition, where incompatible worldviews can clash without either being proven objectively wrong, and where the grimdark horror often comes from watching unbridgeable gaps between species lead inevitably to violence. Space Marines, and especially Dreadnoughts, represent faith taken to its absolute extreme. Not faith in the sense of belief without evidence, but faith as a total commitment of identity, as a psychological architecture so fundamental that removing it would destroy the self it sustains. The Emperor is not merely something Space Marines believe in. He is the lens through which they understand reality, the foundation of their moral reasoning, the source of their purpose. To ask a Space Marine to reject the Emperor is like asking them to reject the existence of their own consciousness. It's not just unlikely or difficult, it's ontologically impossible. This faith serves a purpose in the grim darkness of the far future. The universe of Warhammer 40,000 is one where literally everything is trying to destroy humanity. Chaos entities whisper corruption from the warp. Tyranids devour entire worlds. Necrons awaken from eons of slumber to reclaim the galaxy. Orks exist in such numbers that they cannot be permanently defeated. In the face of such overwhelming, eternal threat, the human response has been to create defenders equally extreme in their commitment. Space Marines are not merely soldiers. They are walking manifestations of absolute dedication, proofs that human will can endure anything if properly tempered and directed. Dreadnoughts take this even further. They are what happens when that dedication extends beyond death, beyond any reasonable limit of service. They are martyrs who cannot complete their martyrdom, eternally suspended in a state where their suffering validates rather than questions their faith. Every moment of their existence proves their devotion. Every battle fought is evidence that the Emperor's light still guides them. The worse their existence becomes, the more noble their endurance appears. This creates a being that is, in a very real sense, psychologically unbreakable through conventional means. Not because they are particularly strong-willed, though they certainly are, but because breaking them would require destroying the very structure of their consciousness. It would be like trying to remove the foundation of a building. While expecting the structure to remain standing, the whole thing collapses into incoherent chaos. Orks, on the other hand, represent the absolute opposite of this complex psychological construction. They are simple to the point of being elegant in their simplicity. They fight because fighting is fun. They follow the strongest because strength is what matters. They believe in Gork and Mork not through faith, but through the same certainty with which they believe gravity pulls things down. There is no psychological architecture to maintain, because there is barely any psychology to speak of beyond immediate impulses and genetic imperatives. This simplicity is both Ork strength and their limitation. They don't suffer existential crises because they don't have the capacity for existential thought. They don't question their purpose because purpose is self-evident. Fight, win, grow bigger, fight more. The WAG field ensures that the more successful they are, the more success begets more success in a self-reinforcing cycle that requires no conscious maintenance. When these two extremes of psychology meet, when complex, multi-layered faith confronts pure, uncomplicated violence, the result is not a clash where one must triumph over the other. Instead, it is a collision where both sides simply cannot affect each other in the ways they normally would. The Ork cannot break what they cannot understand how to grasp. The Space Marine cannot make the Ork comprehend why they remain unbroken, because the Ork lacks the conceptual framework to understand faith as a distinct phenomenon. There is a dark comedy to this scenario that is very much in keeping with the black humor that runs through Warhammer 40,000 lore. Imagine Orks, who have successfully slaughtered countless enemies, who have broken the will of Imperial Guard regiments and brought terror to entire civilizations, completely stumped by a single immobilized warrior in a can. They can't make the prisoner cooperate. They can't understand what the prisoner is talking about. They can't even tell if they're making progress because they don't know what progress would look like in this context. Meanwhile, the Dreadnought, suffering tortures that would break most beings, might actually find the Ork frustration somewhat satisfying in a grim way. Every failure of Ork interrogation is a small victory, proof that even captured and helpless, the Emperor's warrior remains unconquered. The Space Marine might take a certain pride in being incomprehensible to the Xenos, in representing something so far beyond Ork understanding that their captors don't even know how to begin attacking it. This dynamic also reveals something about the nature of conflict in Warhammer 40,000. This is not a universe where understanding your enemy is necessary for fighting them. Orks don't need to understand Space Marines to kill them, and Space Marines don't need to understand Orks to cleanse them from Imperial worlds. Galaxy is full of species that are fundamentally incomprehensible to each other, that fight wars without any real communication or meeting of minds. But when circumstances force direct interaction beyond the battlefield, when capture and interrogation enter the picture, these incomprehensions become critical. Orks interrogating a Dreadnought is like a fundamental force of nature trying to negotiate with a religious icon. There is no common ground, no shared framework, no possibility of meaningful exchange. This is, in many ways, the essence of the grimdark setting. It's not just that everything is terrible and everyone is suffering. It's that the terrible suffering often serves no purpose, because the different factions of the galaxy are so fundamentally different that they cannot even comprehend each other's motivations. The Dreadnought's faith, which brings them such suffering but also such purpose, is completely invisible to the Orks. The Orks' simple joy in violence and strength is something a Space Marine can observe but never truly understand or share. The result is a universe of eternal, pointless conflict, where beings torture each other without achieving anything beyond the infliction of pain, where species commit genocide against each other without ever understanding who they're killing or why, beyond the simple fact that the other exists and therefore must be destroyed. The Ork cannot make the Dreadnought betray the Emperor because that would require a level of psychological sophistication the Ork species simply does not possess. But even if the Ork could understand what they were trying to do, the Space Marine's conditioning would likely resist anyway. Both sides are locked into their natures, unable to truly affect each other in any way except violence. In this sense, the scenario of Ork interrogation failing is not just about the specific matchup of Ork psychology versus Space Marine conditioning. It's a microcosm of the entire Warhammer 40,000 universe, different forms of power and being that cannot coexist, cannot understand each other, and can only resolve their differences through endless, purposeless war. Conclusion: the immovable object. We return, finally, to to our original question. Why can't orcs make a captured dreadnought talk about the Emperor? The answer, as we've explored across thousands of words, is multi-layered and touches on fundamental aspects of both species psychology, the nature of faith in the 41st millennium, and the brutal realities of a universe built on incomprehension and violence. On the most basic level, orcs lack the tools necessary for sophisticated interrogation. Their torture methods are crude and direct, designed for immediate effect, rather than long-term psychological manipulation. They have no patience for the slow work of breaking down a subject's mental defenses. They don't understand psychology in any sophisticated sense, either their own or that of other species. This means they approach interrogation the same way they approach everything, with violence and the expectation that enough force will solve any problem. But a dreadnought is not a problem that can be solved with force. The Space Marine trapped within has already endured torments that make most orc torture seem gentle by comparison. They have lived for centuries in a state of sensory deprivation and physical deterioration. They have watched their humanity slowly erode as the machine they're bound to becomes more real than their own withered flesh. They have been tortured every moment of their existence by the very nature of being a dreadnought. What could orcs possibly do to make this worse in a way that would break rather than reinforce their resolve? More fundamentally, the faith that sustains a Space Marine is not something that can be attacked through conventional torture. It is the foundation of their identity, installed through years of hypno-conditioning and psychological modification, reinforced by centuries of service. To question the Emperor would require the dreadnought to question the basic framework through which they understand reality. It would be like trying to convince someone that the laws of physics don't apply. The mind simply has no structure to support such a belief. The Ork, field, that peculiar Gestalt psychic ability that makes Ork belief warp reality, cannot help them here. The field affects how probability works and makes crude technology function, but it cannot rewrite the neurological conditioning of a Space Marine. Even if it could, orcs don't have a coherent belief about captured Space Marines should renounce the Emperor, that the field could reinforce. The concept is too abstract, too far removed from the immediate physical reality that orc belief operates on. What we are left with is a scenario of perfect incompatibility. An immovable object, the dreadnought's faith, meets an unstoppable force, orc violence, and neither can affect the other in any meaningful way. The orcs can torture the dreadnought's body, but cannot touch their faith. The dreadnought can proclaim the Emperor's glory, but cannot make the orcs understand why this matters. Both are locked into patterns of behavior and thought that make any outcome except eventual frustration impossible. This scenario, dark as it is, captures something essential about Warhammer 40,000. This is a universe where understanding between different species is not just difficult, but often impossible. Where beings are so fundamentally different in their psychology and nature that they might as well be from different realities. Where faith and violence and duty and joy all coexist without ever truly touching each other, like parallel lines that extend to infinity without ever meeting. The dreadnought will never betray the Emperor to orc interrogators. Not because they are particularly heroic, though they certainly are. Not because the orcs are ineffective torturers, though. They certainly are that too. But because the question itself assumes a common ground that does not exist. It assumes that faith is something external, something that can be removed or replaced. For a Space Marine, and especially for a dreadnought who has nothing left but faith, it is the very core of being. You cannot remove it without destroying the person entirely. And in a universe of only war, where every species fights every other in an endless cycle of violence, this fundamental incomprehensibility means that interrogation, understanding, even basic communication between enemies is often impossible. The orcs will torture the dreadnought because that's what orcs do to prisoners. The dreadnought will proclaim the Emperor's glory because that's what Space Marines do when facing death, or worse. Neither will achieve anything beyond inflicting suffering and receiving suffering in turn. Neither will gain any real understanding of the other. And eventually, the Dreadnought will die or be rescued, and the Orks will move on to other battles, and nothing will have changed except that one more ancient warrior's service has finally ended. This is the grim darkness of the far future, where understanding fails and only war remains, where a captured Dreadnought can be tortured for weeks or months without ever being broken because the Orks simply lack the capacity to break what they cannot comprehend, where faith forged in a forge that doesn't care about suffering or doubt or reason becomes quite literally unshakable, where the universe continues its pointless violence, uncaring of the fact that none of it achieves anything except more death and more suffering and more war. In the end, the Ork interrogators will fail. The Dreadnought will remain faithful until the absolute end. And somewhere else in the galaxy, other Orks will capture other space marines. Other interrogations will fail in exactly the same way, and the cycle will continue, as it has for 10,000 years and will for 10,000 more. Because in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and understanding, true understanding between species so different they might as well be from different universes, is perhaps the rarest thing in the galaxy. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the grimdark realities of Warhammer 40,000, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. We explore the lore, the battles, and the horrifying implications of the 41st millennium, one topic at a time. The story of why Orks cannot break a Dreadnought's faith is, ultimately, a story about incompatible realities colliding in the most violent way possible. It is about what happens when beings from fundamentally different psychological universes try to communicate through the only language they share, violence. And it demonstrates, perhaps more clearly than any other scenario in the vast lore of Warhammer 40,000, why this galaxy is doomed to eternal war. There can be no peace when understanding is impossible. There can be no negotiation when the parties involved cannot even comprehend each other's motivations. There can be no resolution when one side sees faith as the foundation of existence, and the other sees it as meaningless noise to be ignored or beaten out. The Ork and the Dreadnought are locked in a dance that can only end in death, and even that ending resolves nothing, because the same dance will play out again somewhere else, with different actors, but the same inevitable conclusion. This is the tragedy of the 41st millennium. Not that everyone is suffering, though they are. Not that war is endless, though it is. But that the suffering and the war serve no purpose beyond their own perpetuation. The Dreadnought's martyrdom teaches the Orks nothing. The Orks' cruelty does not break the Dreadnought's faith. Both sides remain exactly as they were, locked in their respective natures, unable to change or grow or learn from the encounter. And yet, within this pointless cycle, there is a kind of grim nobility to the Dreadnought's endurance. They do not break because breaking is not possible for a being whose entire identity is built on faith. They continue to proclaim the Emperor's glory, not because they expect to convert their torturers, but because bearing witness is itself the purpose. The suffering has meaning because they choose to give it meaning, because in a universe of blind violence and thoughtless cruelty, the act of maintaining one's principles in the face of overwhelming opposition becomes its own justification. The Orks, for their part, are neither evil nor good in any moral sense. They are simply being what they are, creatures of violence and simplicity, operating according to their nature without malice or understanding. They torture the Dreadnought not out of hatred, but out of curiosity, and the vague sense that prisoners should be made to give up information. When they fail, they will not learn from their failure, because learning would require a capacity for self-reflection they do not possess. They will move on to the next fight, the next conquest, the next opportunity for violence, unchanged by the encounter with the immovable faith of the Emperor's champion. In the end, the question of why Orks cannot make a captured Dreadnought talk about the Emperor is answered not by pointing to any single factor, but by understanding the vast web of incompatibilities that makes such a scenario impossible. The Ork psychology that makes them fearsome warriors makes them terrible interrogators. The Dreadnought conditioning that makes them unbreakable also makes them tragic figures, trapped in endless service with no possibility of escape. The WAG field that makes Ork technology work cannot affect the deep neural architecture of Space Marine faith. The universe itself seems designed to ensure that these two species can never truly communicate, can never truly understand each other, can only circle in an eternal dance of violence until one or both are destroyed. This is Warhammer 40,000 in microcosm, beautiful in its horror, tragic in its inevitability, and ultimately meaningless in its endless repetition. The Dreadnought will never talk, the Orks will never understand why, and the war will continue, as it always has and always will, in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war. Until next time, may the Emperor protect you, and remember, in the darkness of the far future, faith is not just a belief. It is the only thing standing between humanity and total annihilation. Even when that faith means eternal suffering in a walking tomb, proclaiming the Emperor's glory to enemies who can never understand why it matters.